It's really important in the teaching role to combine the qualities or to unify the qualities of both confidence and humility. A confidence in what we do know, and we've all practiced to some extent, and we've learned certain things and have developed a certain amount of wisdom, and we should have confidence in that. There are things we do understand and that we can share and that can be helpful to people. And at the same time, it's really important to have a lot of humility and honesty about where we actually are in the practice.
Hello and welcome to the Metta Hour podcast with Sharon Salzberg. I'm Lily Cushman. I produce this podcast, and today we're bringing you episode 247, a Fireside Chat with Joseph Goldstein. This is the 5th episode in our Fireside Chat series, and this series originally was hosted by IMS Online, the online virtual branch of the Insight Meditation Society, and it's been great to bring the episodes here to this format. The long-awaited appearance of Joseph Goldstein on this series is finally here. And maybe I should tell you who Joseph is if you don't know. Aside from him being Sharon's neighbor, Joseph is one of the other co-founders of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Mass. He's also a guiding teacher on the Founders Council there, and he's also a co-founder of the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies, as well as the Forest Refuge. Joseph first got into Buddhism when he was part of the Peace Corps in Thailand in the mid-60s, and he's been studying and practicing meditation since 1967. He is an author of many books. Probably the most well-known is Mindfulness, as well as Insight Meditation, some classic titles. And he is quite literally Sharon's neighbor. They live in a duplex at the Insight Meditation Society property. And this is, of course, not the first time he's been on the pod. And you may already know Joseph from his podcast on the Be Here Now network, The Insight Hour. So having said all of that, this is a really fun conversation because it's so singularly pointed to Joseph's early meditative life and what brought him to Buddhism, why he was drawn to practice in the first place, and some of his early experiences with his court teachers. This event, when it was recorded, also takes a lot of questions from the participants in the live event, so there's a lot of great questions there too. Joseph talks about his first lovingkindness meditation intensive. There's a lot of conversation about Manindra and his teaching style and kind of how differently that affected Sharon versus Joseph. These two have something quite unique in that they just happen to have kind of had parallel tracks and quite often were studying with the same teacher at the same time. So that's kind of a fun parallel. This conversation also includes a lot of talk about the early teaching days for Joseph and Sharon, both in the founding of IMS and teaching at Naropa and Boulder, and just their early retreats during that time in the 70s, and some of the obstacles that they each worked with as they were kind of building more confidence as young teachers. There's also some questions about the immense popularization of mindfulness, of meditation, and how to work with self-judgment, self-acceptance. Also, what advice he has for people who are embarking on their very first retreat. So lots of good stuff here. And I do want to give a big shout out to IMS Online for lending us this program and just tell you a little bit about them. As I mentioned before, this is the virtual branch of programming of the Insight Meditation Society that came into being during the pandemic. And there are some things being offered there that are just happening virtually. There are some that are hybrid programs where it's both happening at the brick and mortar location at IMS and virtually. So wherever you are in the world or in your practice, I highly recommend you go check them out because there's a whole mishmash of things, including a book club and lots of good opportunities for community and learning. And their website is dharma.org, dharma.org. I also want to mention that there's a couple of other really excellent episodes with Joseph on the Metta Hour. If you head back into the archives, there's one that's kind of similar to today's, which is actually me interviewing Sharon and Joseph together, which is incredibly personal and kind of follows the early timeline of Joseph's life, of Sharon's life, and their initial years in practice. And that is episode 199. Okay, so let's get into today's conversation, a fireside chat with Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein.
It's a great delight to be with you all. It's a great delight to be with Joseph, whom, of course, I've known for I must be more than 50 years now, which is almost an incredible thing to say. I can't even believe those words are coming out of my mouth, which must have meant we were children when we met, and we kind of were. And the whole conceptualization of this program actually came from a program I did many years ago with another friend, a colleague named Sylvia Borstein, who we were sitting on a stage in Washington, D.C. together and hadn't really thought about a theme or anything. She said, I just want to have a conversation when we're up there. And so the first question she asked me was, what's the most impactful thing a teacher's ever said to you? So I was put on the spot because I hadn't prepared anything. And I talked about that. I responded, and then I asked her the same question. And I thought, it's kind of a great way of being together, with colleagues, with friends, with one another as a larger community, and kind of seeing what emerges from the kind of conversation we might have in our living rooms or over the dining room table or something like that. And so what's going to happen is I'll ask Joseph a bunch of questions, and then we're going to open it up, your questions. But it is lovely reading in the chat we're all signing in from, which is such a wide variety of places, including Turkey. Hello. And Joseph and I live in a duplex here in Barre, Mass, next door to the Insight Meditation Society, which is over there through the forest. And somebody asked if we're each in Barre side by side in our duplex. So the answer is yes. We're each in our side of the duplex, speaking to you together. So, Joseph, speaking of Barre, I know you were just downtown in a ceremony for the, what was it, 250th
anniversary.
250th anniversary of the town of Barre, and thinking about that first visit we made, which I guess was in December 1975, to look at the property to decide if that board of directors, that nonprofit, was going to buy it to try to open a retreat center. Do you remember that day? Do you remember the Barre town motto from that day? Do you remember the other places we looked at before we came here?
Yeah. Just to remind people who may not know, although most probably have heard, but it's something I referred to when I participated in that town celebration. The town motto is tranquil and alert, which so sums up the meditation practice and what we're trying to cultivate. So I just mentioned to them that when we saw the town motto, we thought, well, this is clearly the right place to be, which it is.
So, the journey to opening up the retreat center here was interesting and magical in so many ways. We were pretty recently back from India. I came back, I think, 6 months later than you in 1974. And when we were teaching retreats, it was all on invitation, and it was all kind of haphazard, as I recall. We were sleeping in people's living room couches and just crashing in different people's houses. And a letter would arrive saying, I can get together some friends and a cook. Will you come teach a retreat? And everything in those days was in the form of retreats. That was, what we were offering and what we understood. And then we teach that retreat. And then at the end of it, we never knew if there'd be another retreat until the next letter arrived and we go back to someone's living room couch. And then one day somebody said to us, why don't you start a retreat center of your own in this country? It would be like a sacred site. It would be a place where the energy that gets generated as people come together with these values and common purpose, it doesn't have to dissipate. And that friend suggested, he said, I know all the people who can help you. They're all in Massachusetts. And he was correct. And so we started looking up and down the East Coast for a retreat center and ultimately ended up in Barre, Mass. Do you remember some of the places along the way?
Well, I do, because I grew up in the Catskills, in the resort part of the Catskills. And there were a lot of old hotels that were up for sale, because the resort industry was in decline by then. And so we looked at a lot of these hotels. They were really quite depressing. So even though they might have morphed into a meditation center, I think we did really well by coming to Barre. I do want to clarify the record about something you said, though, Sharon. You were mostly sleeping on couches because most couches were not long enough for me. So I was sleeping on the floor.
Let's be clear.
Yes, we're just for the record.
Okay. Also, for the record, when I say we were teaching these retreats, I was too petrified to give public talks. So you were really, you were giving all the talks. And, the first retreat we taught together, Joseph and I, was a 30-day retreat in the Sequoia Mountains. It became the genesis for Joseph's first book, The Experience of Insight. And, the format, if any of you have not done intensive retreats in this style, people practice during the day. There's often an instructional sitting, there's Q&A, there's meetings with the teacher, and then there's one kind of formal talk, a lecture at night. And I was too terrified to give that talk ever. So 30-day retreat, a month-long retreat, meant 30 talks, all of which Joseph had to give. And people were going up and yelling at Joseph and saying, why won't you let her speak? Why won't you let her have a voice? And he'd say, I'd be delighted if she would just give a talk. I could have a night off, but I couldn't do it. I was too scared. So just to correct the record on when I say we were teaching retreats, that's what they looked like. I was fine doing the Q&A or meeting with people, but I just couldn't bring myself to. And that changed actually for me a lot through metta practice, through loving kindness practice, but that's another whole story. So Joseph and I met in my very first retreat, which was 1971, January of 1971 in Bodh Gaya, India. S.N. Goenka had pretty recently before then left Burma and had come to India and was teaching these intensive 10-day retreats. And I had gone to India as a college student earlier, like in the fall of 70, and was looking for a very practical, direct understanding of how to meditate. And after, searching for some time, somebody suggested these intensive 10-day retreats, the next one of which was going to happen in Bodh Gaya. And so I arrived there thinking that's just what I'm looking for, and it actually was exactly what I was looking for. And that's where I met Joseph, who, from his side was having a fine time in Bodh Gaya, practicing for how many years at that point?
About 2.5 years, I think 3 years.
And how many Westerners in the town or in the center made it seem crowded?
Yeah, in those early years, we were staying at the Burmese Vihara, which, because Burma was closed at that time, it had been built for Burmese pilgrims, but they weren't coming, so they opened it to Westerners who wanted to study there. But in those early years, when I first went there were about 4 or 5 Westerners. And then over the next few years, it became crowded with 10. And then Sharon and the hordes came, and there were 100 people or more at the Burmese Vihar. So I had to adjust.
It reminds me a little bit of when you had to adjust in 1974.
Yeah, that's another story. So when I came back from India in 74, and I ended up teaching at the first summer session of Naropa Institute, they had given me this small apartment, while I was teaching there. And it was in that time that Sharon and many other friends from India returned to the States. They were looking for a place to stay. And I was the only one with an apartment. So I don't know how many, 5, 6 or so old friends came to stay in this small 1-bedroom apartment. And I was busy teaching. I was working hard. And at first it was a bit, shall we say, stressful, just accommodating to all these people in my apartment. But at a certain point, I had a kind of mini satori, which served me really well. At a certain point, I realized all the distress I was feeling happened because I thought it was my apartment. And as soon as I let go of the my, then it was just a shared space, as we had done countless times in India, where it was no problem at all. And it was just such an interesting, really, teaching, of how claiming things as I or mine on every level at times can be problematic. And the release of that really just opened up into a place of ease. So right from the beginning, there were some lessons to be learned.
So let's go back to 1971, the first invasion of Joseph's Nice Quiet Life. Your principal teacher at the time was Anagarika Manindra, correct?
Yeah.
And when I think of various teachers, and I'll bring up Deepa, for example, a little later, Manindra kind of stands out in my mind as the one with kind of like the pith instructions, like the sentence or a few sentences he would speak that would kind of just turn your mind to have a whole other perspective on things. And so I'm wondering if there were particular teachings or one-liners, from Manindra that were very impactful for you.
Yeah, there were. And so the one I want to mention, it needs a little background to it. So I had been in the Peace Corps in Thailand after I graduated college. And that's where I first connected to the Buddhist teachings, but really hadn't done much practice. I just a little bit, but certainly no intensive meditation. Came back to the States, but I really wanted to continue. But there was nothing happening at that time, at least that I knew of, in terms of meditation, Buddhist meditation in the States. So I just had the desire to go back to Asia and to find a teacher. I realized that if I wanted to deepen my practice, that I really needed a teacher. So friends had been in India, and I thought, well, I'll go to India and I'll hopefully find someone who can guide me, in more intensive practice. So I went around for a while. I traveled around in India, going to different ashrams, to looking for some Tibetan teachers at one point. Finally, I ended up, through a set of circumstances, I ended up in Bodh Gaya, where there were a few Danish people staying at the Burmese Vihar, practicing with Manindra. And they took me to meet him. And he said something which really became kind of the bottom line for the next 60 years of practice. I mean, it was just so to the point. He said, and it was just so simple. He said, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. There was nothing to join. There was no ceremony. There was no ritual. There was no organization. It was just, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. And the common sense of that, it just so resonated with me. It seemed so straightforward. Of course, how else can we understand our mind? Except we don't need necessarily to be sitting down, but we can be standing or lying or whatever. But we need to learn how to observe our minds. And of course, that's what the practice is all about. So it really, it was the big hook. It was the Dharma hook, because it so resonated pragmatically. It was such a pragmatic instruction. Yeah, that was the beginning of it all.
Manindra, for me, exemplified kind of a quality of fearlessness in so many ways. And there are many, kind of pith instructions I could quote, and I do quote, but one that just came to my mind listening to you speak, Joseph, was, there we were in India, and there were so many teachers and swamis and yogis and gurus and so many people, some of whom were, now looking back, clearly a little strange. And people would say to Manindra, I want to go to South India and study with this Swami because I heard he could, caress my forehead and every bit of my suffering would disappear instantly. And Manindra would say, go check it out. And his quote was, the Dharma, or the truth of things, or the nature of things, it doesn't suffer from comparison.
Yeah.
Just go, instead of saying, you're my student and I'm holding on to you and it's threatening to me if you go anywhere else. And it was really quite fearless in its own way.
Yeah. I also really appreciated that about Manindra. He was so open-minded, and could see value in many other traditions as well, even though he was so committed, to Vipassana in this particular practice. But he's not at all judgmental. And so he would almost extract, the gems from a wide range of traditions and teachers. And he himself, he used to tell stories of himself going around and being with some of the great saints of India, and the Hindu saints. I know he spent time with Anandamayi Ma, who was a very renowned saintly being, and would tell stories about being with her. And so that was a great foundation. And I think in a way, it's informed IMS in the sense that even though it's a center devoted to Theravada Buddhism, it's not revolving about any one tradition or any one lineage. And as many of you know, we have a range of teachers within the Theravada tradition, but teaching very different styles, different emphasis. And I think a lot of this came from that inspiration from Manindra, who was just so open to different expressions of the Dharma. And in this world of sectarianism, it's just so refreshing, to have that openness.
There's a question that came in from the Q&A button I want to ask you, which is, what do you love most about teaching?
Oh, there are really so many things. First, it's sharing what has been so valuable for me in my own life, and so transformative, that it's just a joy to be able to share that and to find and be with people who are also interested, exploring, and being on the same journey. So it's just tremendously gratifying. And the other aspect which really stands out for me in teaching. For me, and I think you'll particularly love this, Sharon, but the quality that I feel is the foundation or the bedrock of teaching, that teachers can draw on and embody, is the feeling of metta. So when I'm working with people, the metta comes so naturally. It's just part of the exchange. And it's such a beautiful way to be relating to people, relating in that field of just wishing well, and having that heart connection. And it's kind of interesting. Sometimes I describe the process of us meeting, with meditators, and usually the meetings, when they're individual, are 10 or 15 minutes long. And I often would think to myself, this is like a 10-minute, 15-minute marriage, because the exchange is really very intimate. We're talking at a level that touches us deeply, and sharing really profound aspects of ourselves. And so it has that intimacy. And then 10 or 15 minutes, that person leaves, and there's a new marriage. So that marital status suits me. Which is just to say there is a quality of intimacy that's really beautiful in teaching.
So metta, of course, meaning loving kindness. And I can remember the first time I ever heard of loving kindness practice. Do you remember when you first became acquainted with it?
Well, I do, because it really had a profound effect on the whole trajectory of my practice. So when I first went into the very first time that I was in Bodh Gaya and practicing.
Before we all arrived.
Before you all arrived, this was in 1967. I had zero concentration. I had studied philosophy in college. My mind loved to think about things. I ended up in Bodh Gaya, watch your breath. And the whole hour, I would just be sitting thinking and loving it. I was really enjoying it. The hour went quickly, but I wasn't getting any place. And that first time in India, it was relatively brief. Maybe a couple of months. I had to go back to the States for something, but pretty soon returned to Bodh Gaya. But in that time at home, I saw a movie, which the name of the movie was Charlie, and it was based on a book called Flowers for Algernon. And just very brief summary, it was somebody with mental disabilities. And in the storyline, people were just making a lot of fun of him and not being very kind. And then through some miraculous drug, his mind became brilliant. And he was in that state for a while, and then the drug wore off, and his mind reverted to how it had been. So the movie just described this trajectory. And I was so touched or moved by basically the unkindness with which people were relating to him, when he was really in a distressed state. When I went back to India, I told Manindra, being moved by that, I would really like to do intensive metta practice, where we do it all day long. So instead of Vipassana as my main practice, for the next 6 weeks or 2 months, I was just doing metta. I really wanted to open my heart so I would not be like the people depicted in the movie, just to cultivate that feeling of kindness. So I did the metta for that 6 weeks or 2 months. And in addition to the cultivation of the feeling, of kindness, metta is also a concentration practice. And so as a result of doing it intensively, for some reason, for me, that worked better than trying to develop the samadhi on the breath. And it took a while. It was not an instant success. But after about a month or so, just from doing that loving kindness meditation, my mind really became somewhat concentrated. It was really the first taste of concentration. And I remember having the thought, oh, this is why people like to meditate. Because when the mind finally settles down through whatever means, and different people may find the breath more suitable or loving kindness more suitable. There are many different approaches. But when our minds finally do settle down to some extent, and it doesn't mean we become super meditators, or it's just like a moderate level of steadiness of mind, that's when the practice, even when it's difficult, the practice just becomes so much more enjoyable because we're not struggling to keep coming back. The mind has kind of settled in the flow, whatever the flow may be. So metta really did have a very significant role in my practice. And then when I started returning to Vipassana practice, that's when I could really begin to do it. Yeah, so it's really a wonderful practice on many levels.
So speaking of metta, I wanted to talk a little bit about Deepa Ma. I think we met her together in Bodh Gaya. I can't quite remember the year, if it was 72, 71. Do you remember?
No.
Okay. One of those years.
Right.
This woman, Deepa Ma, had been a student of Manindra's when he was in Burma. Then she was living in Calcutta. He was living in Bodh Gaya, and she came to visit him. And my experience of her was different than when I described Manindra as, those one sentences or two sentences. It was really her presence and her almost overwhelming effusion of love and compassion coming out of her. And especially given what had been really tragic circumstances in her life, the loss of two children and the loss of her husband and some other things, to have somehow, through her practice, almost metabolize that grief and that sorrow in such a way that it became this force of compassion coming out of her was really amazing. And yet there were, of course, teachings, and she would speak very specifically. So what do you think of when you think of Deepa Ma?
Well, I just want to add one or two things about her accomplishments. Quite the opposite of me. Her mind had this amazing natural ability to concentrate. And so from the very beginning, she had this amazing capacity to go into deep, deep states of concentrated absorption, which she then both applied to her Vipassana practice. And as Munindraji would tell us, she didn't speak of this to us herself, but Munindraji loved to speak about her to us. She had reached kind of the first stages of enlightenment within a few weeks of practice. It was just so quick because the depth of her concentration was so amazing. And then she developed it even more through Munindraji's guidance for all the different kinds of, special powers that can come in the mind through that depth of concentration. And again, Manindraji had told us all these stories of the way he had trained her and the different things she could do. So when I met her, as Sharon said, it was her presence which was just so impactful. We would sometimes visit her in Calcutta, and really, she was quite poor. So she was living in just very, very modest circumstances in Calcutta. She was living with her daughter just basically in two rooms, up 4 or 5 flights of stairs, and the physical surroundings were not that pleasant. However, we would go up and meet her, go into her room, and it was like going into a room filled with light. It was so amazing because, I'm not a particularly mystical sort, but even for me, I would go into the room and it was just like being bathed in that energy of love and of peace. And it was that combination of silence and stillness and the understanding of the vastness of her mind and heart. So there are pictures of the two of us. So I'm quite tall. And Deepa Ma she basically came up to my waist. And we'd be walking, in Bodh Gaya, walking along, holding hands. And I'm kind of towering above her. But in my mind, she was the one with this inner vastness, inner space, and the magnitude of the love. So she was just an amazing being. And in one way, I think perhaps the most inspiring of all my teachers, because she just, the depth of her practice and the magnitude of her heart was just so beautiful and inspiring. What's possible, and even though I have a long way to go, maybe many lifetimes, but it really showed what's possible. And that was really inspiring to me.
Somebody did write a book about Deepa Ma. And Deepa Ma's her nickname, means Deepa's mother. Deepa was her surviving daughter. So she was known as Deepa Ma.
Mhm.
And I think the book is called Deepa Ma as
Mhm.
well. It's just Dipama by Shambhala Publications. So
That's a beautiful book.
yeah, just to try to talk a little bit more about those powers and about concentration. In the Buddhist tradition, it's not really a division, but there's a distinction that's made between practices that emphasize concentration, which is the
Mm.
gathering of our attention and energy, usually around a single object, and insight meditation, the engine of which is mindfulness, which is really paying attention to the nature of the different experiences that might come and go, to see, for example, deeply the truth of impermanence, that these thoughts come and go, these feelings come and go, these sensations come and go. And we cultivate concentration. We need some concentration, as Joseph was inferring. Otherwise, we just sit and plan our vacation one more time, and every thought will take us away forever. But in the traditions in which we were largely, you could say, raised, you don't need like immense concentration in order to then broaden your awareness and begin paying attention mindfully to many different kinds of experiences, and really deepen your understanding, your insight, your wisdom. And you can also pursue just concentration, in that gathering of your attention. And it's almost like I used to think of it like the energy of the universe returns to us because it could be available to us and it's not, because we're just throwing it away into like obsessing about the past and anxiously projecting into the future. It's a lot of life energy just gone. And so we gather as we practice concentration to any degree. And so my understanding is that, what Manindra did with Deepa Ma was the most important thing is the development of insight, because that really frees us. It frees our lives, it frees our hearts. But he knew that she had such a tremendous talent for concentration just in and of itself that he decided to train her like in the old ancient ways of deepening just concentration to see what would happen. And he asserts that, sure enough, what happened then was happening with her, which was that concentration, because of all that energy coming together, is like power. We know power can be used for good or used for ill. It's not freedom in and of itself, it's just power. But it's on the basis of that power that people have what in the West we call the paranormal powers or something like that. So she had both. But when I think of her, I don't really think about those stories. I think about how incredibly loving she was, and she never seemed to reject anybody that came her way. And she was also strong. It's like if you were doing a retreat with Deepa Ma, you didn't nap. You weren't lazy. She was tiny, as Joseph said, but she was really like a dynamo about put your heart into this. This is really important.
I'll just share one on that point. So one time she was visiting and teaching at IMS, and before the retreat started, there was just a week-long retreat for the teachers who were going to be teaching the 3-month course. And Deepa Ma's instruction to us was, I want you to just sleep 3 hours a night and not lie down during the day. Well, that was really hard, but because she was who she was, I mean, it really inspired us. Okay, we're going to just try the best we can. She did give one extra instruction, which proved to be super helpful. She said, just sleep 3 hours a day. Don't lie down during the day. But if you fall asleep when you're sitting, never mind. So, of course, with just 3 hours a night, and I'm sure most of my colleague friends were nodding off. But what was so interesting about that last instruction, because usually and quite commonly, when we're nodding off and sitting and sleepy and drowsy and dull, very often the mind is fighting with it, just kind of striving to be more awake and fighting with the sleepiness. But because she had said, if you fall asleep when you're sitting, never mind, I found that my mind stopped fighting with it. And I just kind of settled into being sleepy. And because there was no fight, there was no inner conflict, I actually came out of it a lot more quickly. It's like so much of the energy that keeps us in that state is the struggle. And without the struggle, so I would nod off for a few moments, really, or maybe a minute. But then I would sit up and be totally alert. So there was a big lesson in that for me in learning to relax, and how much relaxation is a big part both of concentration and of insight. Yeah, and so she knew how to push and inspired us to do it, but also gave the tools for doing it skillfully. So that was really a big help, and it stayed with me, that balance.
So somebody put a question in the Q&A button, which I think is almost related to these kind of stories. She said, I need to start teaching meditation for my MMTCP certification. Coming from the Tibetan tradition, where teachers are extraordinary humans, I'm very petrified. Can you relate to that?
Yes, I think that it's really important in the teaching role to combine the qualities, or to unify the qualities of both confidence and humility. A confidence in what we do know, and we've all practiced to some extent, and we've learned certain things and have developed a certain amount of wisdom, and we should have confidence in that. There are things we do understand and that we can share and that can be helpful to people. And at the same time, it's really important to have a lot of humility and honesty about where we actually are in the practice. And most of us are not at the place that Deepa is at, or maybe some of these great Tibetan masters in Asia. And to have that understanding, yes, there are things we can share, and there are many things we're still very much practicing ourselves. So I think if there's authenticity in both of those ways, then the teaching role can be quite easeful, where there's no pretense and we're not trying to live up to a certain image or how we think we should be. We're just ourselves and sharing what we know in as skillful a way as possible. And that's enough. And it does take some time in the teaching role to settle into that. So I would be very patient with yourself. A lot of different feelings and thoughts will come up, maybe comparing yourself to others or judging oneself. You give a talk and, oh, I blew it on that one. So I just want to share something, my own process in doing this in the beginning years, when I was first starting. I think it's quite common in giving Dharma talks. There's kind of an inner critic that can be arising in the mind, about how we did and to go over. And I noticed a pattern that was very freeing for me to notice, that in those talks where I felt, this wasn't quite up to par. That was my own inner feeling about the talk. For some reason, those were the talks that got the most notes from the meditators saying how much they appreciated it. So having seen that over and over again, I just retired the inner critic, realizing that it wasn't giving very accurate assessments of the actual value, and then just trusting the dharma. If our motivation is to just share what we know in the best way possible, people will benefit from that. And then just to trust that. And that can take a little time to learn how to relax in that way. But the teaching trajectory definitely goes in that direction.
You know what else I found can take a little time is being able to just say, I don't know.
Yes.
When someone asked a question, I remember certainly in the earliest days of my teaching, and I'm going to ask you to tell a story in a minute. I really, of course, did not know, but I had a whole tradition to refer back to as kind of doctrine. Instead of saying, I don't know, I would say, well, you know, but of course I didn't really know. And I think it would have been more helpful just to be genuine and say, I don't know. And later on, of course, I heard the Dalai Lama so many times, people would ask him a question and his response would be, I don't know. I'm like, well, if he can say it, I can say it, you know. But you have some story about, was it Dujam Rinpoche and rebirth and the different
Right.
perspectives and the different, yeah, that was the story that came to my mind.
Okay. I'm not quite sure how the story relates to what we've been talking about, but it's a good story.
Oh, I can explain. Well, yeah, no, as I recall it, the alternative to having a position in one way or another in that question of rebirth and so on would be actually to say, I don't know.
Yeah. So just as a little background to it, but because I think there is, in this story, I think there's a really important teaching. So I was in Boulder teaching at Naropa, and you might have been there that summer as well. And Dujam Rinpoche, who is considered really one of the greatest of the Tibetan meditation masters, very highly revered. And there was a poster about his giving a talk, you know, in a public talk. And on the poster, it said Dujam Rinpoche, and then it said incarnation of Sariputra. Now, Sariputra in the Theravada tradition was the chief disciple of the Buddha, second only to the Buddha in his understanding and wisdom, fully enlightened. And in this tradition, when one is fully enlightened, one doesn't come back, right? There's no longer reborn. So this was I had spent maybe 15 years practicing this tradition firmly of the view that fully enlightened beings are not reborn. And then there's this poster of Dujam Rinpoche, incarnation of Sariputra. So my mind just went on tilt. That's not possible. You know, enlightened beings don't come back, and yet here's a great enlightened being, and that was the same incarnation of so-and-so. So for a while, I was really conflicted. And then it dawned on me, as Sharon was pointing to, that I really had no idea whether he was the incarnation of Sariputra or not. All I knew was this tradition says this, the other tradition says something else. But the great lesson for me, and I think it can serve many of us in our lives, is that we don't have to have opinions about things we know nothing about. Because they're not based in anything. And so the elaboration of the I don't know might be describing how one tradition sees it one way, another tradition sees it another way, and that I don't know. So that seems like a very honest response, but it points to kind of much more mundane circumstances just in our lives where we have so many opinions about so many different things. It might be interesting just to reflect, is this something I actually know something about or not? Is it just a received opinion that we're giving voice to? And it's really freeing. It's really freeing to let go of attachment to our opinions. And again, it's not to say that we shouldn't have them, but to really understand whether they're based in real understanding or not.
So I've talked about when I started teaching my complete terror at public speaking, and now my fear of admitting I didn't know everything. So do you remember some of the challenges you dealt with when you started teaching?
Well, I think one of the early challenges, so for me in the Buddhist teachings, I think Sharon referenced this a little bit earlier, how the insights of insight meditation really have to do with refining our understanding of impermanence and of what the Pali word dukkha, or the unsatisfying or unreliable nature of changing phenomena, and of selflessness, emptiness of self. So for me, and each one of us may have an affinity for understanding one or the other of these, even though we do experience and relate to them all, but sometimes one aspect really draws us. And for me, really from the beginning, was the experience and understanding of selflessness, of emptiness. So when I first came back teaching, kind of that was my response to most. So people would come in with whatever problems they were having, whether in meditation or in their life. And I remember in those early years, the gist of my responses would be, well, it's just all empty. There's no problem. It's just empty phenomena. It's selfless. There's no one there. It took me a while to realize that while that's true, it's not necessarily the most useful response in every situation. And so what I really had to learn is, instead of jumping to that understanding as people are relating their experiences, again, whether in meditation or just their life circumstances, rather than jumping to that deeper aspect of it's all empty, it was really important to meaningfully connect with where people actually were, to let it in and to understand the actual present circumstance of what people were going through, whether they were describing something in their meditation or in their lives. And once that connection was made and the acceptance of that, and beginning to unpack those experiences, and trying to help people relate to them in a skillful, accepting way, then gradually one could move on to teachings about emptiness and selflessness. So it's really opening up more to the importance of incorporating a certain level of psychological, emotional understanding, as well as kind of the dharma understanding of emptiness. And it was bringing those two together, which was an important evolution, in my teaching.
Somebody actually asked in the Q&A, is I don't know the verbalization of emptiness. Do you think?
Not necessarily. I mean, it could be, but it depends if one is identified with the I don't know. I'm one who doesn't know. So that's always a potential. But if it's just the reflection of, as I was saying before, a genuine humility, then it could be. And there was one writer, he went under the pen name of Wei Wu Wei. I think it was actually English or Irish, can't remember exactly. Spent a lot of time in Asia, and he had a very profound understanding. And he wrote quite a few books, and they were filled with just these very short aphorisms expressing his insight. And one of them has just struck me very strongly. He said, true humility is the absence of anyone to be proud. And so that's a good expression of I don't know, expressing selflessness or emptiness, right? So it's not humility as a stance. Oh, I'm so humble, I don't know. It's like, to the degree we understand the selfless nature, humility is the expression of that absence of self. So in that way, it really is, or can be, an expression of emptiness.
Mm.
Just one more aphorism that came to mind from Wei Wu Wei. He said, those who are firmly attached to a belief in self is like a dog barking up a tree that isn't there. I love that.
Pretty cool. I should ask you about your poetry. Maybe I will in a minute. I remember way back when, as I sort of said, basically the only format pretty much there was Naropa, and those were classes. But other than that, the format we were presenting practice in was retreats. It was intensive retreats. And somebody came to us so many years ago, let's say 45 years ago, 40 years ago. And they had this kind of wild idea. They said, we could take videos of talks and put them in health food stores for sale, and people would go in to like pick up vitamin C or something like that, and they'd see this video and maybe they'd buy it, and more people would get interested in meditation. And it was kind of a shocking thought. And we had all these conversations about it, because for you or I to access teachings that were practical, we could say actionable, actual ways to meditate, it was a lot of effort. It was a trip to really the unknown, going to India when I was 18 years old. I'd never even been to California, having grown up in New York City, and then I was going to India. For you, it was through the Peace Corps, and then back to the States, back to Asia. And sometimes people had to be highly, highly motivated by suffering in their life, or highly motivated by just a tremendous desire to understand things in a deeper way. But it was never a kind of a casual motivation, because you had to go so far and try so hard to find a teacher. And so then we said, well, what if you just go into the health food store and you don't have that kind of motivation, and you just want vitamin C, and you pick up a recording? Is that okay? And of course, all these years go by, and there's retreats, and there's workshops, and there's apps, and there's a million other ways. And maybe the motivation doesn't need to be so powerful anymore, because it is so accessible. But in this world of so many forms of teaching, I'm wondering, first, do you have a favorite environment to teach in? And what do you think about this explosion?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really important question that comes up a lot. As I'm sure everybody on this call knows, mindfulness has just become mainstream. A lot through the mindfulness-based stress reduction initially, which kind of brought mindfulness training to the whole medical field, and then just spread across the country. And then so many other teachings now in what generally is called secular mindfulness, which in a way has extracted the methodology of mindfulness from the larger body of Buddhist teachings. And so people will often ask, well, what do you think about that? Very often it leaves out, some of the really essential aspects of the teachings. But my sense is anything that helps people is good. And so if people are learning mindfulness in a secular setting, and that becomes the point of entree for experiencing some level of the practice, they begin to taste some of the fruits of practice, that's a good thing, and can help, even if it's not aimed at awakening or enlightenment or liberation, as the Buddhist teachings are. It's still, in a very practical way, helping people just live their lives in a more balanced, peaceful way. And what I think happens is that some subset of those people really get intrigued by the possibilities of going further, and with that first experience of observing the mind and being with one's own experience in a mindful way, it very often touches something quite deep in people, and they see a greater potential than they might have imagined at first. So basically, I think it's a good thing. I think it would be helpful, especially for people who are teaching in that context, to frame it in the way acknowledging that these teachings come from the Buddhist tradition, and there's a depth in those teachings that people at some point might be interested in exploring. Some will and some won't, and that's fine. We all find our own path. So I think it's a good thing, and it's good to make known the possibility of the teachings that actually lead to freedom, to liberation, because that's really what the Buddhist path is all about.
So, what in your life inspired you to first pursue the study of Buddhism?
Well, as I said, I studied philosophy at college, and so my mind is just naturally very investigative. It likes that. It tends to that, and I think it's been a quality all along. And sometimes I take it to extreme, and it's actually one of the reasons why, unlike Deepa, I did not have a natural facility for concentration, because the investigation factor was so strong that I just loved really looking and reflecting on and observing and figuring out. So it's a very powerful force, and it can lead to a lot of insight, but it also needs to be balanced. And I had to really develop the other qualities which would balance that out. But that was my motivation. It was just interest in how my mind worked. And I remember when I was in the Peace Corps, I was teaching English in Bangkok. I was just 20, 21 years old. People remember, if you're not at that age now, at least for me, but I think it's quite common. At that age, there's a lot of emotional angst, just trying to figure things out. And who am I? What's going on, and dealing with all the emotions that come from that. When I was in the Peace Corps, I have this distinct memory of one day I was looking in the mirror, and the question arose in my mind, my heart: who's in there? Who's behind that reflection that I'm seeing? Because somehow I knew that it wasn't just the surface appearance. There's some being in there, and the intense interest in exploring and finding out who's in there. So that kind of energy that inspired me to practice.
So, there are a number of questions that have come in about practice, which I'd like to try to get through at least some of them. So, one is, how do I avoid judging myself when I realize I've been lost in thought for a long time during meditation?
Okay, it's something that I think is really skillful to do. So generally what happens when people are practicing, we're trying to be with the breath or some other object, the mind gets lost in a thought, and then at a certain point, we realize we've lost in our thought and hurry back to the breath, or whatever our object is. It's really illuminating to take a moment, just at that moment, we're lost in a thought, and then the moment we wake up from being lost, not to rush back to the breath, but right in that moment, to really see and experience the difference in one's experience between being lost and being awake. And in that moment of coming out from being lost, in that moment of transition, the difference is very obvious. We can really understand and experience, oh, that's what it was like, just lost in a thought. this is what it's like being aware, being awake. And so we're exploring on quite a profound level the difference between delusion and wisdom. Right there in that moment of coming out from being lost. So rather than judging oneself for being lost, every time we come out from being lost, we should take delight in being awake. And so there will be countless moments of delight in your practice, because as many times as you're lost in a thought, that many times do you awaken. It's just that our mind has the habit of focusing on the being lost and not appreciating and seeing the quality of wakefulness that has just arisen. So it's really just changing how we're relating to that moment and taking delight. Oh, great, awake again, and appreciating what the quality of wakefulness is like. So this is a great practice, and there are countless opportunities to do it.
Oh, here's another one. Another question. Do you recommend a metta practice for developing self-acceptance?
Well, you'd be a good one to answer that, and I certainly, yeah, absolutely, just absolutely. Yeah. And in that way, okay, so this reminds me of a Deepa story. Somebody once asked her whether they should practice metta or vipassana, insight practice. And her response was, for me, in essence, there's no difference. When you're practicing loving kindness, aren't you also mindful? And when you're mindful, aren't you also loving? Loving in the sense of in insight practice, the whole practice is being accepting of whatever's arising without clinging, without aversion. And so to really see the two as aspects of each other. And then we could do the formal practice of either and both, right? In terms of really developing and strengthening the self-acceptance, because both contribute to it.
And there are two questions that I see as kind of connected. So one question is, how does one move from short daily practices to being ready to try a 1-day or several day retreat? I've only been at this for about a year, but feel a bit intimidated to take that leap. And then the other question was, I'm embarking on my first IMS, it's the Insight Meditation Society, retreat at the end of July. Any suggestions for a first timer?
Yes. Okay. So there's a very simple answer to the first question. Go for it. It can be scary, and a little trying, going into a situation of something new and we don't really know what it's going to be like. But the whole retreat, and especially, well, all of the retreats, but for beginners and people with very little experience doing a day long or a weekend, the retreats are set up to be very, very supportive. And in our tradition, unlike some other Buddhist traditions, I would say it's not very formal. So even though there's a schedule of, sitting and walking and then meetings with the teachers, it's not as formal, for example, as Zen practice, which reflects, the Japanese culture. So it will not be a problem, even though in anticipation, one, may have a little anxiety or fear. But if you have the interest, that is the main quality that's needed. If you have the interest, I would just go for it, knowing that you will be really well supported in whatever comes up. So I wouldn't hesitate at all. I think anybody who's interested should just go for it.
And do you have any advice for the person who's coming?
Yes. One piece of advice: if you can come without expectation of what the experience will be like, of what your meditation should be, if you can leave expectations at home and then just come with almost with a sense of adventure. It's just coming into quite a remarkable environment. I don't know of other environments that, I was going to say, accomplish what happens on a silent retreat. It's such a special situation for going inward and for exploring ourselves. So if we can enter in, and there's, as I said, lots of support, instructions, guidance, help if different problems come up. But if we can go to it without an expectation of how it should unfold, because we don't know. Maybe it'll be really easeful, maybe it'll be all kinds of struggles, but we learn from it all. And so if there's that sense of interest and exploration, then it's an amazing journey, and that attitude will really serve you well. There's a phrase that I've been using a lot in teaching lately, which is don't waste your suffering, which is just acknowledging that in our life and in our practice, there will be difficulties, which come up. In the Buddhist jargon, they're called hindrances, just mind states that cause some kind of difficulty, like aversion and desire and restlessness. So these things come up. But not wasting our suffering means having that attitude of interest and investigation, so we come to understand it and to develop or find some freedom in the midst of it. So it's an extraordinary opportunity, and I don't know of many other situations that provide it. This kind of inward journey in a structured setting with support and guidance. As I'm sure most of you can tell, we love it, even when it's difficult, because it's just so rewarding, this process of self-discovery or non-self-discovery.
There's so many more questions that we're not going to get to, and I really apologize. And maybe I'll just one more. If, say, you were in your 20s now and just setting out on your path, where in the world do you think you would go now for teaching and guidance?
I think I would come to the Insight Meditation Society. Really, when I think back to the conditions in Asia, of course, being in my 20s, it was a great adventure, but the conditions were not easy at all.
How big was your hut in Bodh Gaya?
My meditation on Bodh Gaya was 6 by 7, 6 feet by 7 feet, and all the others was 6 by 6. But since I'm so tall, I made a special one for me, 6 by 7. So the conditions here, and in other centers, in the States, which offer these teachings, the conditions are so conducive to practice. So, of course, there is going to Asia and practicing in Buddhist cultures is wonderful in its own way, and we learn things from that. But there's no need to do that in order to get deeply immersed in the meditation practice. And in some way, it's a lot easier here, just because the conditions are so conducive.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been a great delight to interview my neighbor.
Likewise.
Hey folks, thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Joseph and his many online offerings, he does not have a website, but there's a page for him on the IMS website. So if you head over to dharma.org/teacher/Joseph Goldstein, you can also find Joseph on the Sam Harris Waking Up app, as well as the 10% Happier app with Dan Harris, the other Harris. And Joseph does offer a variety of different teachings through IMS. He just recently finished up a mentorship program, so definitely keep your eye out for things that are centered around IMS. And of course, the Insight Hour podcast right here on the Be Here Now network. For all things Sharon, including a free guided meditation, online courses, a whole archive of On Being articles, and of course, her many books, you can head over to SharonSalzberg.com. This has been the Metta Hour podcast, brought to you by the Be Here Now network. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live with ease.